Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Divya Murali, Research Associate at the Institute. President elect Donald Trump is set to take office as the 47th President of the United States of America in January 2025. Donald Trump's second term in office is poised to be a continuation of his first term, where US's pre-2017 free trade principles and approach to economic policies is expected to undergo vast changes. As the world waits to see the real effects take root, in today's episode of South Asia Chat, we have with us Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Trade and Economics at ISAS-NUS, who will help us unpack the implications of Trump 2.0 trade and economic policies that could impact the world and the region. Welcome to today's episode, Dr. Palit.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Divya.
To begin with, what is your view and broad expectations of President elect Trump's second term at the White House? Is it fair to say that his second term will be a continuation of his first term in terms of policies relating to global trade and economics?
That actually, Divya, is an interesting question because I don't think that you get to see a US president coming into office and so much being written about what his economic policies will be, or specifically what his policies on world trade and trade relations with partners are going to be. And this is all because of the fact that Trump 1.0 was quite an exceptional period. And that essentially was because of two reasons. Trump 1.0 indicated very clearly that under his presidency, the United States is prepared to step back from the rules based world order, which the United States itself had invested so much in creating for the last 35 to 40 years since the onset of economic globalization from the late 80s and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth. Now, this realization was quite a bit of a shock to most, including, I would dare say, many experts in the United States who found it very bizarre to understand why the United States was stepping back from its own multilateral rules-based world order. And one of the areas where this impact was felt most was in international trade, because Donald Trump very clearly indicated that this his view of international trade was not a collective view. He wouldn't be looking at trade as a block or as a group or in a holistic sense, not through the prism of a global rules-based trade order, but he would consider every trade relationship with each US trade partner as an exclusive relationship. And he would go about assessing them bilaterally and take whatever steps are necessary to bring those relationships into the favor of the United States as much as possible. Now, what this meant, and this is what I think has been the main cause for consternation as we head into a Trump 2.0 period, is that in the Trump worldview of trade, the trade relationship in the US interests must be a relationship as much as possible where the United States holds the surplus in its trade relations. Now, that obviously, as we know, is not always possible for the very simple reason it's not just the United States, which is the world's largest economy, but no economy really produces everything. And beyond production, no economy is in a position to hold on to that much of surplus with which can exchange with the rest of the world and end up having a surplus with the rest of the world at all points in time. There are countries with whom the exchange relationship is going to be imbalanced, but this is not something which the Trump worldview on trade agrees with. And the concern, as we noticed the last time, again, was mostly with those countries with whom the United States had a very large trade deficit, beginning from China and then other countries in various parts of the world, including India, with whom The US has a trade deficit, and there are countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and several other countries with whom there are trade deficits. And the Trump worldview dictates that these trade deficits need to be corrected, and the way forward, the corrective measure is to impose tariffs, which will bring down the degree of market access that exports from these countries have in the United States market. It will fetch the US revenues, and it will also at the same time, not only just restore favor for the United States in the overall trade balance, but it will also probably make the countries at the receiving end of these tariffs to work on ways in which the United States exports can get better access into their markets. Now, this was what characterized Trump 1.0, and during the run up to the presidential campaign earlier this year, Trump actually indicated that he's going to not just follow this worldview, but he's going to step even beyond what he had in the first term in certain cases. One of them is with respect to China, on whom he has, in the beginning, suggested that he's going to raise tariffs by 60%. He has followed it up after his election with views that on the first day of the presidency itself, he would impose high tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which are strong trade partners of the US. And not just that, they formed the US Mexico Canada trade agreement, which was probably known as NAFTA in the past. And then the other countries, including the BRICS group of nations, on which he would want to impose tariffs and not just stop there, perhaps also take steps which would be taken in his understanding of what are the best interests, both economic as well as security. Now, what that means is his entire presidency, and as it gets closer to 5th of January, becomes a rather unpredictable and uncertain uh, period of transition. And there are people who are being brought into the administration who have a penchant for taking certain extreme views on certain issues. And again, those extreme views are views with which the moderate or the middle path will always find it difficult to exist. So there are many countries across the world, not just China, but bigger economies, emerging markets, smaller economies, and including, I would dare say, the G7 group of countries outside of the United States, for example, in Europe and other parts of the world, who are actually waiting to see uh, what are the steps that Donald Trump takes. So I will stop there for the time being with the caveat that there is a lot of uncertainty going ahead, and unfortunately, we won't get to know whether these apprehensions are really going to manifest unless and until we go through the first at least 1 to 2 months of the presidency.
So, just continuing the conversation a bit on the tariff aspect on which you spoke about. President Trump calls himself a tariff man and has made several varied statements on his intended trade policies and tariff measures. For instance, he intends to use it in ways to promote US manufacturing, to retain jobs in the US, to keep dollars placed firmly in the global trade, or to even use tariffs as a tool to support his immigration policy, which effectively sort of alters the tool's original purpose. Could you sort of dive in a little bit more and let us know what is your reading of Trump tariffs? What does it mean for the global economy, and how do you see it impacting trade and economics in an already sensitive global trade climate, particularly for the global south?
I would argue that when we look at the context in which President Trump is coming into this argument, which is broadly the slogan of MAGA, Make America Great Again. There is indeed this reality that large parts of American manufacturing, domestic American manufacturing, is not there in the United States anymore. So there's the Rust Belt, there's the car belt, there are other heavy industries in the manufacturing domain which have moved on from the United States, but it has moved on for very obvious reasons. And one of them is the fact that the United States itself from about 2 to 2.5 decades ago, was a strong champion of the view that production must move in line with comparative advantages and efficiency. So, if, say, for example, a country like Mexico or a country like China or a country like Vietnam is actually able to perform certain tasks of manufacturing better than what they could be obtained for in the United States, then it makes imminent sense for those parts of manufacturing to move to those countries. So, whereas the original ideas, including the design and the greater administration of the supply chain, continue to remain with the American manufacturers, like the Ford, for example. Their vertical specialization moved out into various other parts of the world. And this was not just true of the United States. This happened in many parts across the world, including in Europe, where, for example, the pharmaceutical industry stopped making the bulk drugs and the intermediates because they could be done much more efficiently and higher volume in a country like China. And these pharma firms in the US and Europe started focusing basically on what their designs and R&D parts were. Now, if this line of thinking is accepted, then there is nothing wrong in the United States having come out of that phase of manufacturing. On the other side, one could argue that United States consumers certainly benefited from cheaper imports. So, for example, cars made in Mexico could come to United States at lower prices than at those at which they would have been available if they were made in the United States. Similarly, various other items from various other parts of the world came to the United States at cheaper rates, and they really benefited the United States consumers. But this is a view, this is a line of economic thinking which clearly doesn't appeal to Mr. Trump. So he wants to reset the entire history of this dislocation of manufacturing in a way which aligns with his worldview, and he finds tariffs to be the way to go forward on that. Now, what tariffs would do is they would immediately first make United States imports much more expensive on every item. So when those imports come into the United States, the consumers are going to find those imports much more expensive than what they did now. And this is true with respect to a large number of countries who benefit from unilateral market access to the United States under its GSP program, or even otherwise, not necessarily through bilateral trade agreements, but even through the basic most favored nation rule of doing trade. All these exports to the US would become expensive. Now, this will definitely affect the abilities of these countries to export to the United States as they find their products becoming less competitive. But one must also remember this is also going to badly impact the United States consumers. And that clearly is one view which President Trump is happy to overlook at the risk of making the entire US economy, following imposition of tariffs, a much more expensive and inflation prone economy than what it is right now. And already the interest rates in the United States are at a critical point. The inflation is beginning to rise, so it's not a very comfortable condition. So if this is one way in which he plans to use tariffs, the other way is that he also wants these tariffs to become a tool of foreign policy. So let's say, for example, in those relationships where he thinks that there are economies which are strong security partners of the United States and who are benefiting from US military support or defense support to them in their various localities and regions and territories, but are not doing as much for the United States trade and economy as they should. This is a view which comes out of the thought that these economies should technically be beholden to the US for the role that they play in this regard. So if that is the view to be taken, then President Trump is beginning to use tariffs as something which would deny or bring down market access for these countries into the United States. And in return, he would expect these countries to support the United States more, not just in the areas of trade, but also in other areas. Let's say, for example, in the way the United States addresses its relationship with China, you would want these countries to come out in much greater, wider, bigger support of the United States, unless, failing which he would be forced to bring in tariffs. So he's using tariffs also as a foreign policy and a strategic tool to kind of quote unquote uh, make countries fall in line with what he thinks should be ideally their balanced relationship with the US. He clearly thinks that this is transactional to the extent that these countries cannot assume that the United States will continue to remain their defense partners without they doing their bit to honor that relationship. And this is something which is going to get reflected in his understanding of how the United States should figure in the North American Treaty Organization, for example, in the NATO, or in various other countries where the United States is acting as a provider of security. And he might use that role in the context of tariffs to bring in what he thinks is a more balanced relationship for the United States with respect to these economies.
Mr. Trump was also not known to favor the World Trade Organization, the WTO. He is also looking to pass the Trump Reciprocal Tariff Act, which follows the principle of an eye for an eye on tariffs with trading partners. It is in stark contrast to the pre 2017 US's trade policy stance and goes against the grain of WTO principles. In the context, where do you see the WTO go from here, and how do you think global trade systems in general will evolve in an era where free rules based trade tradition is challenged and multilateralism is on the decline?
Divya, the WTO's crisis goes back to what I had mentioned in the beginning, because the US under Trump is clearly committed not to staying invested in the rules-based world order that it itself had created, and where it enjoys, almost an unchallenged polarity.
Mm.
Since it is no longer interested in staying invested in that world order, one of the victims of that inclination is the WTO, because the WTO is one of the best examples of global rules, at least in the economic sphere, that have been created after economic globalization, the latest round of economic globalization came into play. And one of the closest examples of the cynicism that President Trump has in WTO was the fact that the United States refrained from appointing judges or agreeing to appoint judges in the appellate tribunal of the WTO. And that was really something which has made the WTO to some extent crippled in its functioning for the very simple reason that out of all its mechanisms and systems, the dispute settlement system of the WTO has arguably been the one which has functioned most robustly over the last 30 years that it has been set up. Having said that, I must also point out that there was a view among many trade experts and countries that what wasn't done by President Trump would be reversed by President Biden and his team, which unfortunately hasn't happened. So we can't put the entire blame on President Trump in this regard. Perhaps the language was different, the rhetoric was different, it was much more mellow, it was nuanced in a different way. But even under Biden, the United States really did not show a very spirited attitude in bringing the WTO back on rails and making it a truly effective global rules trade-based system. So now I suppose when we again look back at the way President Trump is expected to address the United States and its relationship with the WTO, one possibility about which many countries have been talking about is that he takes the US out of the WTO. Now, one really doesn't know what implication that will have, but on surface, what that would mean is that the WTO really becomes meaningless to a considerable extent because if the world's largest economy is not a part of the global rules-based trade order, then one would tend to question the legitimacy and purpose of that rules-based trade order. And this, I think, also has to be looked at in the context of the fact that the second largest economy of the world, which is China, uh, then is likely to become a a much more prominent actor in the rules-based trade system. It will clearly position itself as the champion of multilateralism. And in fact, while eyebrows are being raised over the significance of President Trump inviting President Xi to his inauguration, one really doesn't know how the mind games are being played in this regard. What are the strategic ideas that are being thought out in this regard? But the point is that the WTO without the US and China at the helm of things is the situation with which many countries of the world that are members of the WTO will not be very comfortable with. So again, those countries also might, in their own wisdom, think of withdrawing back from the WTO or maintain at best a cosmetic symbolic presence in the WTO. So what we will to see is a WTO which becomes increasingly toothless, increasingly ineffective, and by and large, global trade gets to be adjusted, worked upon, and settled outside the domain of the WTO. It's going to mean a whole new world of trade altogether compared with what we have seen in the last 3 decades.
Um, what do you think will be the future of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework introduced by the current Biden administration under Trump 2.0? Do you think it has a future?
Well, the IPEF is something which has not really enthused President Trump, and he doesn't see much virtue in it. So, a large number of experts again think that the IPEF is not going to be persisted with by the United States because it's likely to go the way the United States went with the TPP, where President Trump, on the first day of his taking office, brought the US out of the TPP in January 2017. But having said that, there's also another view, and that other view is the IPEF is a framework which doesn't engage with market access, unlike the TPP, because the TPP did have a very exhaustive scope of market access, including eliminating tariffs on more than 90% of the items being traded between the CPTPP members, which meant the United States giving bilateral market access to all members of the bloc. And in the run up to the TPP, there were a lot of domestic political reservations expressed within the United States by a large number of lobbies, agricultural lobbies and industry lobbies, over the adverse impact of the TPP rules on their prospects. So, what I mean to say is that the TPP, from a Trump perspective, or for that matter, from any US political leader's perspective, was a much more politically sensitive hot potato to be managed and handled. Now, the IPEF really, till now, has not been that much of a political soup stirrer. And this also needs to be looked at in the context of the fact that that part of the IPEF talks, which does involve some controversial issues, has not yet been concluded. It's still being negotiated, which is the Pillar 1 or the fair and resilient trade pillar. Now, that might mean that President Trump might not think that the IPEF is very consequential or deserving attention, and he might just let the IPEF go. Uh, there is also this view that to some extent the IPEF does serve the US security agenda by providing a counterbalance to China, by bringing together the US security allies, which is again something which might not appeal to President Trump much because his view of looking at these strategies is quite different. But it might well be that going ahead, at least in the early days, we might feel that the IPF is not really worth acting upon or wasting time upon and just let it be. And finally, in this regard, I'd like to say that this is a possibility which I think was preempted by the outgoing US administration of President Biden. So, what they have done in that respect is they have been able to ensure that two parts of the IPEF, the Pillar 2 and Pillar 3, and also almost in Pillar 4, the agreements have been formed and they have been made into operational agreements. They have come into force. And it's not just that the United States, there are a large number of other economies working on it. So even if the US formally withdraws from it, since this doesn't engage in market access and since this is not a binding framework, I don't think there will be as much of an implication in regional trade and regional economic routes
Mhm.
as it had during the TPP time.
Pivoting a bit towards green policies. So, the US, under the current administration, Biden administration, has been actively pursuing to lead the green transition, similar to China through its green industrial policies. Could you share your thoughts on what Trump presidency would mean to this pursuit? And where do you think it leaves the global south in the larger climate and sustainability conversations?
The impact of President Trump was already felt in the COP29 at Baku because there were concerns that the United States certainly is not going to stay committed to the global goal of mitigating and addressing climate change. And there will be implications of that insofar as mobilization of climate finance is concerned and a large number of other areas are concerned, including the fact that President Trump was earlier a champion of fossil fuels, and it is expected that in the current presidency also he will maintain his support for fossil fuels. So, which essentially means that in the fight on climate, it is no more that the United States will take a position that renewables and alternatives must be encouraged at the expense of fossil fuels. That, to some extent, is a blow for the global fight on climate. And to a very large extent, I think it also has implications for the way the global south is going to address this problem because already at the COP29, there have been reservations expressed by a number of countries from the global south, including India, that the $300 billion fund that has been promised till 2035 for the developing countries to support them in their battle against climate is insufficient. But having said that, there's also this interesting view that is coming up that 2035 is a 10-year period, and by that time, or well before one reaches that point, this current round of Trump presidency is expected to get over. And whosoever be the next incumbent, whether it be the Democrats or even the Republicans, is unlikely to be as much of a climate skeptic as President Trump is. So that room for sticking on to the finances and increasing the commitment of the United States to the cause for climate has been maintained. That's a view that has been shared by some experts. But I think if we look at more immediate short term and the next 4 years of Trump presidency, I think the challenge that developing countries will face is that they will have to work on the assumption that the United States is not really going to support insofar as their own endeavors are concerned in bringing up projects that contribute to climate. This might actually, coming back to the earlier question that you asked, Divya, this might actually affect the progress on Pillar 3 of the IPEF, which has a large number of projects in the clean economy goal, and where already the United States, along with Australia, Korea, and Japan, has committed grants to the Climate Catalytic Fund. So all those funds, all those efforts, all those initiatives are now in a state of flux, are now running into uncertainty. There is not much clarity on how this would go forward. But I think the global south, it is important to consider is, in a sense, global south, or most countries there must have been prepared for the onset of Trump 2.0 and the fact that the US commitment to climate might not remain consistent. So ultimately, it comes back to the situation where they really have to make as much arrangements for moving forward on this agenda through their own initiatives as possible. We don't know whether there are some surprises in store for us as far as the climate agenda is concerned, because there are views that since Mr. Elon Musk is a very prominent member of the current Trump administration, and since he owns the Tesla and the electric vehicles, and since there is also this view that Mr. Musk's electric vehicle comparative advantages have been badly affected by the efficiency shown by Chinese EV manufacturers. This is an area where he would actively want Trump's support. If that happens, then we would get to see a very selective application of a climate friendly measure in one segment of eco friendly and climate friendly industrial regeneration. But other than that, I think as a worldview, as a vision, and as a country staying committed to climate, it's time to think differently.
Right. To conclude, if you could briefly sum it up for the listeners, what would you say are the major changes, positives, not so positives, challenges that the world and particularly the global south is expected to navigate in President Trump's second term in office?
I would say, Divya, that President Trump's second term in office, and as he comes into that, is made further complicated by the fact that the current global situation is much more complicated than what it was when he took office in 2016. At the time, the biggest uncertainty in the global world order was probably with the imminence of the Brexit, which was kind of something very unexpected. Background to Trump 2.0 is a much more complicated world order than it was in the first location, because this time there is greater despondency in the world over the fact that military conflicts are not ending. There is crisis that continues in Russia. There is crisis that continues in Israel. The Gaza situation is getting from bad to worse every day. There are tensions brewing in other parts of the world. Economically, the world is not doing particularly well. There are many disturbances, vulnerabilities, and complicated issues that countries are having to deal with them in a in a somewhat unexpected and unexploratory fashion. Now, if on top of all this we face a situation where you have the world's largest economy and the most strong military power at this point in time, at least, taking charge with a worldview that is not really inclined towards stability, at least stability in the way in which it is understood by most proponents and followers of a multilateral world order, then that generates greater anxiety. But having said that, I think one must also understand and accept the fact that President Trump's views are very unorthodox. It is the mainstream opinions which have run into problems with his views. But one might actually see these views might able to produce positive outcomes in a way in which nobody has expected. And what I mean to say at this sort of basic issue is that the mainstream efforts, global efforts, collective efforts have not been able to end the biggest challenges the world that is facing right now on the military side, on the economic side, on the climate side. Perhaps somewhere President Trump's much more unorthodox approach will yield some results. So let's hope that it will not be all black. There will be some gray and perhaps some glimmer of white emerging from the end of the presidency.
That's the hope, Dr. Palit. It's been lovely chatting with you. Thank you for your time and for sharing your rich insights on the subject. We will continue to engage with you on the subject to leverage your expertise on it as Trump 2.0 unfolds. You are listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also follow us on social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.